silence for the avoidant is not an absence. It is a structure, carefully built and continuously maintained, and the things that bring it down are never the things the avoidant predicted they would be. The avoidant silence is not passive. This is the first thing that needs to be understood before anything else, because the misreading of the silence as indifference, as the simple, uncomplicated absence of feeling or investment, or the ongoing interior presence of you in their world, is the misreading that causes the most damage to the person waiting on the other side of it. The silence is active. It is maintained. It requires from the avoidant a continuous low-level expenditure of psychological energy to sustain the energy of suppression, of rerouting, of managing the feelings that the silence is designed to contain so that those feelings do not generate the action that would end the silence, which means that the silence is always, at some level, under pressure. Always being tested by the accumulation of feeling it was constructed to hold back. And there are specific triggers, not random, not arbitrary, not simply the passing of sufficient time, that apply a pressure to the silence that the avoidance maintenance capacity cannot absorb, that force a crack in the structure. That produce, against the avoidant's own resistance, and often against their conscious intention, the reaching out that the silence was specifically designed to prevent. These triggers are not equally weighted. Some produce the impulsive, anxiety-driven contact that arrives in the middle of the night and carries the full intensity of unprocessed feeling with none of the clarity that genuine movement requires. Others produce something more considered, more deliberate, more reflective of actual internal shift. Understanding which trigger is operating when the avoidant breaks their silence is one of the most important pieces of information available to the person receiving the contact, because it determines, more accurately than anything the avoidant actually says in the reaching out, what the reaching out actually means. The first trigger, the undeniable weight of accumulated absence. There is a threshold. Every avoidant who has lost someone significant has one, a point at which the accumulated weight of the absence crosses from manageable to undeniable, from a background presence in their interior life to a foreground one that can no longer be addressed through the ordinary mechanisms of suppression and distraction and the forward motion of daily life. This threshold is different for every avoidant and is determined by a confluence of factors: the depth of the original attachment, the degree to which the person they lost represented something genuinely irreplaceable, and the current state of the avoidant suppression capacity, which diminishes over time under the continuous pressure of unfelt grief. When the threshold is crossed, the silence becomes structurally unsustainable, not because the avoidant has made a conscious decision to abandon it. The decision is rarely that clean or that deliberate, but because the feeling that the silence was containing has accumulated to the point where containment is no longer possible without a cost that exceeds what the avoidant is willing or able to pay. The feeling breaks through in the form of action, the message, the call, the reappearance, not as a strategic choice, but as the path of least internal resistance. This trigger produces contact that carries genuine emotional weight. There is nothing performative about it. The avoidant who reaches out from this place is reaching from the real, undefended depth of what they actually feel, which makes the contact both more moving and more important to receive carefully. More moving because it is real. More important to receive carefully because real feeling in the absence of changed capacity is still insufficient as the foundation for a different outcome. The second trigger, witnessing your movement forward. The avoidant silence depends on some level on a particular image of you, not a fully conscious image, not something the avoidant would acknowledge as an operating assumption if asked to examine their interior honestly, but a background belief functioning beneath the surface of their daily experience that you remain oriented toward them in the way you were oriented during the relationship. that the hope is still present, that the door they walked through is still from your side being held open. This background belief is not malicious. It is the natural consequence of having been, throughout the relationship, the person whose withdrawal you consistently absorbed and returned from. The pattern established you as someone who stayed, and staying in the avoidance unconscious relational architecture becomes an expected feature of the landscape rather than a choice being continuously made. When evidence arrives that the landscape has changed, when the avoidant becomes aware, through whatever channel, that you are moving forward in a way that suggests the door is no longer being held, the background belief is disrupted with a force that the silence cannot absorb. The evidence of your movement does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to be performed for their benefit. In fact, the most destabilizing version of it is the evidence that arrives not as a statement directed at them, but as the simple, visible reality of someone who has genuinely redirected their energy toward their own life, the fullness you are growing into, the way your world appears to be expanding rather than contracting in their absence. This trigger produces contact that is, in its essence, driven by the fear of permanent loss rather than by the desire for genuine reunion. The avoidant is not reaching out because they have changed or because the clarity of absence has produced a readiness for different engagement. They are reaching out because the image that was quietly sustaining the silence, the image of you still waiting, still oriented toward them, has been replaced by an image that the silence cannot coexist with. The distinction matters enormously for how the contact is received. The third trigger, a direct encounter with their own pattern. This trigger is rarer than the others. It requires a specific kind of internal event, a moment of genuine self-confrontation that the avoidant's ordinary defenses do not manage to intercept, and it does not happen to all avoidants with any reliable frequency. But when it happens, it produces a quality of reaching out that is different in kind from every other trigger and worth distinguishing carefully because it is the one most likely to be connected to genuine internal movement. The trigger is the moment the avoidant sees their pattern clearly. Not intellectually, the avoidant is often capable of intellectual recognition of their avoidance long before that recognition carries emotional weight. But experientially, in the full body way of someone who has finally allowed the evidence of their own relational history to land without the protection of the rationalization they usually apply to it. They see the line of people, the recurring shape of what they do, the specific and predictable way they create distance from the things that matter most, and the specific and predictable way those things then leave, and the specific and predictable way they then feel the loss without ever quite connecting the loss to the choice. In this moment of clear seeing, something that functions like genuine remorse arises. Not the guilty performance of remorse designed to produce forgiveness, but the real thing, the kind that is directed not at you as its audience, but at themselves, at the pattern, at the version of themselves that keeps making the same costly choice for the same unexamined reasons. And from within this remorse, the reaching out toward you feels not like an anxiety-driven impulse toward relief, but like a legitimate attempt at something, an accounting, an acknowledgement, the beginning of a reckoning that this time, perhaps, might actually go somewhere different. This is the trigger to pay the most careful attention to. It produces contact that is more likely to come with specificity and accountability, that is less likely to skip over the damage in the rush toward reunion. It does not guarantee change, but it is more genuinely connected to the internal conditions that change requires than any other trigger available to the avoidance psychology. The fourth trigger, the removal of an alternative source of avoidant regulation. The avoidant, in the aftermath of a significant relationship ending, does not simply sit with the absence in the clean, unmediated way that the absence deserves to be sat with. They manage it through the same mechanisms of rerouting and redirection that characterize their relationship with all significant feeling, through increased investment in work, through the pursuit of new connections that offer the early, uncomplicated ease of surface-level engagement, through the various forms of distraction and forward motion that keep the full weight of what was lost from ever landing completely. These alternative regulation sources serve a function. They are not nothing. They provide genuine, if temporary, relief from the pressure of the suppressed grief. But they are also, by their nature, unstable. The new connection that seemed to promise the relief of early ease reveals its own depth and its own demands and its own capacity to generate the same intimacy pressure that the avoidant was regulating against. The investment in work reaches its natural ceiling of satisfaction. The distraction loses its capacity to distract as the feeling it was distracting from continues to accumulate beneath it. When an alternative regulation source fails or is removed, when the new connection ends, when the work achievement fails to deliver the internal satisfaction it promised, when the distraction simply stops working, the feeling that was being regulated against reasserts itself with the accumulated pressure of everything that was not felt during the period of regulation. And in that reassertion, the person who represents the most significant unfelt loss becomes, suddenly and with some urgency, the direction in which the avoidant's unexpressed feeling moves. This trigger produces contact that is largely about the avoidant's own internal state, rather than about you specifically. The reaching out is real, but what is driving it is the management of their own feeling rather than the genuine desire for your specific presence. The distinction is not always clean. Genuine missing of you and the need to regulate internal distress are often entangled in ways that neither you nor the avoidant can easily separate. But it is worth holding as a question. Is this contact about me, or is it about the relief that my response would provide to their current internal state? The fifth trigger, a significant life event that activates attachment needs. The avoidance attachment system, however suppressed in ordinary circumstances, does not disappear under pressure. It emerges. And the circumstances most likely to produce its emergence are the significant life events: loss, illness, professional crisis, the particular existential exposure of a birthday or an anniversary or a milestone that arrives with the unexpected weight of meaning and finds the avoidant without the person they would, if they were being completely honest, most want present in the moment. Significant life events are one of the most reliable triggers for avoidant contact because they temporarily overwhelm the suppression with a need that the suppression was not designed to manage at that volume. The need to be known by someone who actually knows them. The need for a presence that is not performing comfort, but genuinely offering it from the place of actual familiarity. The need for you, specifically, in the way that need becomes specific rather than generic, when the weight of a moment makes the difference between genuine connection and surface connection undeniable. This trigger produces contact that is often genuine in its feeling, but unclear in its implication. The avoidant reaching out from this place may not be reaching toward reconciliation or even toward a conversation about the relationship. They may simply be reaching toward the comfort of your presence in a difficult moment, which is real and human and legitimate, and also does not necessarily indicate anything about whether the patterns that define the relationship have been examined or changed. The warmth of the contact can feel like an opening. It may be one. It may also be a temporary surfacing of attachment need that will, once the life event has passed and the ordinary equilibrium has been restored, retreat back below the surface of the avoidance-managed self-sufficiency. The The sixth trigger, your expressed indifference or genuine detachment. This trigger operates on one of the most fundamental and least flattering aspects of the avoidance relational psychology. The way their interest in a connection is often most fully activated by the withdrawal of the certainty of your interest in them. Not because they are deliberately exploitative of this dynamic. It is not a conscious strategy, and the avoidant who examines it honestly is unlikely to be proud of it. But because the avoidance attachment system, calibrated as it is around the management of closeness, functions with a particular responsiveness to the removal of what it had been unconsciously managing against. When you were consistently oriented toward them, when the hope was present and the wanting was visible, the avoidance system had something to manage. The intimacy pressure, the felt weight of your investment, the background awareness of being someone's something in a way that created obligation. The management of this kept the avoidant in a particular relational posture, available enough to maintain the connection, distant enough to keep the pressure manageable. When the orientation changes, when your detachment becomes genuine rather than strategic, when the indifference is not performed but real, when the hoping has actually stopped rather than being temporarily concealed, the avoidance system loses the thing it was managing against. And in the absence of that thing, something unexpected happens. The intimacy pressure that the system was managing against is replaced by the absence pressure of someone who is no longer oriented toward them. And absence pressure in the avoidance attachment system activates approach in a way that presence pressure activates retreat. This is the painful irony that many people discover in their relationships with avoidance, that the stopping of the pursuit produces more movement in the avoidant than the pursuit itself ever did. The contact that arrives from this trigger is real in its feeling, but it requires the most careful scrutiny of all because it is the most likely to be driven by the avoidance discomfort with your disengagement rather than by any genuine readiness for the depth of connection that the relationship always required. The seventh trigger, the quiet, unglamorous work of time and honest reckoning. This is the rarest trigger and the slowest. It does not arrive with the urgency of loss registration or the drama of witnessing your movement forward. It does not require a specific event or a failed alternative or the activation of an attachment need by external pressure. It arrives in the way that all genuine internal change arrives, incrementally, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one day the accumulation of small internal shifts reaches a point of sufficient mass that it produces a changed orientation toward the question of you and the question of what was lost and the question of what might still be possible. Time in the right conditions that include genuine self-examination, honest confrontation with the pattern and its costs, the willingness to sit with the discomfort of seeing themselves clearly rather than through the protective lens of their habitual rationalization, does something to the avoidant that nothing else quite replicates. It erodes, not the feeling. The feeling often deepens with time rather than diminishing. But the defenses that were keeping the feeling from translating into action, the justifications that were making the silence feel like wisdom rather than fear, the self-protective narratives that were framing the distance as a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation rather than as the latest iteration of a pattern that has been costing them everything they most deeply want for as long as they have been using it. When time and honest reckoning converge, when the erosion is sufficient and the self-examination is genuine, the avoidant who reaches out from this place is reaching from somewhere different from every other trigger. Not from anxiety or loss management or the activation of attachment need by external pressure. From the quiet, hard-won, imperfect but genuine arrival at the understanding that the silence was fear dressed as choice, and that the choice to actually reach to actually try, to actually bring a changed willingness to the connection that was always worth the changing, is one that only they can make and that they have finally made. Contact from this trigger deserves the most thoughtful reception, not the automatic, hope-flooded reopening of everything. The discernment of genuine change still requires evidence over time, and the seventh trigger is the beginning of changed orientation rather than its completion. But it deserves to be received as what it is, the most significant thing the avoidance psychology can produce. Not the impulse toward you, which has always been there. Not the missing of you, which has never fully stopped. The choice of you, deliberate, examined, arrived at through the long, private work of someone who finally, at whatever cost to their familiar self-sufficiency, decided that what they wanted more than the protection of the silence was the possibility of what lay on the other side of breaking it. 7 triggers. 7 distinct forces that bring down the structure of the avoidance silence in 7 distinct ways. Only one of them arrives from the direction of genuine change. The question, when the message comes, when the call arrives, when the silence breaks in whatever form it breaks, is not whether they reached out. It is which direction they reached from. That direction is everything. It tells you not just why they came back, but whether this time there is somewhere real to come back to.